That's the correct one. Chat. Sorry, I wanted to get the chat up just to say we're going to start. No, sorry, go back to that. So you've gone there.
Should we check this and see?
Yeah. Okay. Can everyone hear? Can you hear online? Oh, good. Excellent. Right, hello everyone. My name is Sarah Montgomery from the Language Centre here at Leeds. And next we've got Christina Laporda from University of Central Lancashire.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Just to present myself a little bit, I am Greek and I moved to the UK 4 years ago, and ever since I have been an EAP tutor in Duke University. And it was then that, as a Greek, never having lived in the UK and knowing nothing about UK education, especially at the tertiary level, I had to teach pre-sessional students from Chinese and Japanese origin, my first encounter with them. And I had to prepare them for the reality here. And this is when I thought of the fact that we probably need a number of competences to be able to do something like that, because I could see that even I had some issues with communication, not on the level of the language probably, but certainly on a number of different levels. And this is how then I decided to start my PhD in intercultural competence. I'm focusing on Chinese and Indian students because these are the main cohorts of students I work with. And, but of course, I just finished my first year of my PhD studies on a part-time basis. So please show some understanding on my knowledge on the topic. Instead of an introduction, I chose the quote of two interesting scholars. So the first question coming from Bock is, how can we figure out how to impart something as subtle and intangible as intercultural competence? So it being intangible is something that we should consider. And of course, from Deirdre, the realization that if we do not reach a definition for which we agree upon, then how can we go on to develop or maybe even to assess intercultural competence? So I'm starting with comparing a number of terms and definitions, most of which have come in literature. So earlier in the study of intercultural competence, which started together with acculturation studies, adaptation studies, we had some terms that were repeated, like cross-cultural adaptation, cross-cultural adjustment, or effectiveness. At first, they were interchangeable terms, probably, or they were a little bit referring to a similar situation. But today, of course, adaptation has become a completely different term, mainly used about migrants, for example, and it is a situation, let's say, it is a term used to define when we operate effectively without losing our own cultural identity. So this is a term that is probably not exactly the same as intercultural competence. And here it is important to remember that the fact that, for example, adapting to a new culture entails a number of intercultural competences probably doesn't necessarily equate the two terms. Assimilation has also been confused sometimes with intercultural competences, but again, it is a completely different term. And within assimilation, we usually mean that a person gradually loses their own identity, their previous identity, and they gradually move to the host culture, mainly. So these are terms that it is rather not, it is safer to say that they are not the same as intercultural competence. A few more definitions, especially with more recent literature. Acculturation, a term that has appeared again and again, quite distinct in terms of what it describes. So acculturation is a change, a cultural change. Within intercultural competences, there is no cultural change taking place. Multiculturalism is a term that I think we should focus on a little bit, because I think that multiculturalism is probably a trap that many universities are finding themselves in. So within multiculturalism, and this is why I chose this definition from Portera, he says that multiculturalism aims to discover and tolerate people from different cultures who live peacefully but side by side. So the prefix inter, he refers to intercultural, of course, implies relationships, interaction, and exchange. So I have the fear that universities today have achieved multiculturalism, having different people from different backgrounds, living side by side, but how much effort has been put in place to make sure that these people interact, know how to work together, know how to achieve their communication goals effectively. Slightly different term, biculturalism, as we probably all understand, mainly refers to two cultures taking place, which is not the case within intercultural encounters in general, because when we develop intercultural competencies, we do not only target one particular culture. And of course, global citizenship, which is again a term that comes again and again in literature recently, is probably a broader term or maybe a more general one. Of course, it entails intercultural skills, otherwise we cannot develop global citizens, but again, it is quite different. So in brief, I think that Arasarachnam Smith probably says it all distinct terms, not equivalent to intercultural competence, but of course, intercultural competence is a significant aspect of them all. I'm not sure if it is the umbrella term or if it simply is part of some of them. There is a correlation, but they are definitely completely different terms. So then the question still is here, what is intercultural competence? Another thing to consider is, again, a discussion about intercultural sensitivity. Now, intercultural sensitivity, and I think that Bennett's developmental model is quite easy to understand, and follow, and this is why it appears so much, I think, in literature. I think it helps us all understand different stages of ethnocentrism and ethno-relative development. As he himself says, intercultural sensitivity, when it is developed, can create the potential for intercultural competences, but again, they are not the same. So we need intercultural sensitivity, it can be a part of intercultural competences, but again, it is not the same. Although we will see that one should probably have reached the ethno-relativism if they want to gradually start developing intercultural competences. So then, let's try to steal a few of the most well-known definitions of intercultural competence and see what words are used for them. A very influential definition from Spitzberg and Chagnon, the appropriate and effective management of interaction between people who, to some degree or another, represent different, divergent, affective, cognitive, and behavioral orientations of the world. And upon this definition, we have, again, Deirdre coming and kind of slightly changing it. Intercultural competence is broadly about communication and behavior. So she defines what we need IC for. That is both effective and appropriate in intercultural interactions. And she has a very interesting comment in her paper in 2014, where she says, and all interactions can be considered to be intercultural, which for me is quite interesting. And then I went back to those two definitions and I realized that the word culture does not appear at all. There is no discussion about the cultural other in those two definitions. And of course, one could say, yes, because culture is maybe a term that we should avoid. I would probably say, not necessarily avoid, maybe we could all accept that the term does not necessarily need to be related to our national cultures, but we all carry a lot of subcultural characteristics. And it is not a bad thing to acknowledge that. As the previous speaker said, sometimes, you know, we need stereotypes as a starting point, I think. We shouldn't keep the bias or the prejudice coming behind them, but they are a good starting point in our train of thought when we encounter people who are different. And all people are different. So then I thought of the words effective and appropriate, and literature gives a lot of discussion on both these adjectives. So effectiveness is a very individualistic notion. I will decide if my interaction with the cultural other, if you like, has been effective. If I have achieved the goals that I had in mind. However, appropriateness is not something that I can define in my interaction. It has to be the cultural other who has to decide that. And this is quite important in realizing that intercultural competence is not about oneself only, but it always includes the second person in the interaction. And this is why Spitzberg and Chagnon not came back actually, but added a comment which I like after the definition. So the first part is the definition that I showed you on the previous slide. But then they went a little later to comment that the extent to which individuals manifest aspects of or are influenced by their group of cultural affiliations and characteristics is what makes an interaction an intercultural process. I had prepared some definitions about culture at this point, but unfortunately, time-wise, it was impossible. So I will have to stop here this discussion, but I think that it simply shows that it is us who decide if it is intercultural process or not, if we kind of show more things related to some of the cultural subgroups that we belong to. So as my title said, let's see a few characteristics of intercultural competence, but first let's take out what it is not. So what I have found through literature is that intercultural competence is probably, unfortunately, not guaranteed. So it seems that there is no guarantee that people who, let's say, go through interventions or training for intercultural competences, it is not a guarantee that they will develop intercultural competence ever in their life, because they may lack certain characteristics, certain personality traits, etc. It is not developed by simple exposure to diversity. There is a lot of literature to stress that, and there are some findings from research on that. So we cannot rely on immersion only, and I come back to say that we as educators and universities should consider that. So by simply having students of different cultural backgrounds in the same lecture room, we shouldn't expect that then intercultural competence will develop. Not only that, but there has been an interesting study that I read recently about group activities, and the results concluded, and I think it was from Lian and Schaffner. I think I will find that because I want to be exact on the line that I use. Give me a moment, please. Yes, Lian and Schaffner. So they created those group activities, and they simply had students from different cultural backgrounds in those groups. And that was it. There was no guidance, support, or anything else. And the result was negative. So if there is no support, if there is no guidance, if there is no training, we cannot develop simply by exposing people. Actually, the result was quite the opposite. Students were rather frustrated. And also, intercultural competence cannot be fully achieved because it is a process. So there is no point in time, and I think this comes more or less from Derdorf, there is no point in time where we can claim that we have become completely, so I finished my training from today, you know, I am fully interculturally competent, I have a degree to say so. There is nothing like that. We can simply hope to gradually develop this, but what intercultural competence is may also give some answers. So some of my favorite words used to describe what it is: ongoing, an ongoing process, a lifelong commitment, a lifelong developmental process, an essential lifelong competence, more or less the same thing, but the words for me have a lot of power there. So it is a learning process, and learning happens over time, and it never finishes within intercultural competence. Of course, it is a set of knowledge, a set of attitudes and skills and behaviors, and I have the list of all those things coming from Derdorf's process model of intercultural competence. Of course, she presents it in a circular movement from the attitudes towards knowledge and then to the outcomes, both internal and external. But since my presentation is more about definitions, I thought it should be proper to present them just like that. Interestingly, attitudes and desired internal outcomes have to do with personality so much, and I don't know how much intervention we can have there. So this could probably answer a little bit the first, that it is not a guaranteed, unfortunately, competence that we could have. So what else is intercultural competence then? It is a combination of one's personal abilities and relevant contextual variables. So it is particular to each context, and this is probably the most difficult thing for me to, to perceive, to comprehend deeply. But, and this is probably also why we cannot reach a full level of intercultural competence, because it changes with context. And we have to keep an open mind as to what competences and skills and knowledge we need to be developing through time, so that we can continue remaining or becoming more, maybe more interculturally competent, but not necessarily fully, because we cannot reach that level. So, trying to redefine the intercultural competence. I hope I'm on time. Good, thank you, because this is the last slide. So then many terms have been used, but if our whole discussion is about effectiveness and appropriateness in intercultural communication, then whether we like it or not, whether we use a different term or not, then this is intercultural competence that we're talking about. So this is something that I think we should keep in mind. And also, coming again from Portera, I think I will give you just one moment so that you can read it, and then I will make my final comments. So more or less, I believe that this is the most important thing to keep in mind, that we all need those competencies, and we need to try and find ways to develop those competencies if we want to manage diversity and cultural change, which are always and will be part of our lives. And this is the end of my presentation. I had some references, and thank you very much. If you always have any questions.
We'll start with questions on the chat. Stop share.